I would also like to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we are all living or dwelling at the moment. In this particular case, in where I am, and in fact where Mistress Rowan is that this is the land traditionally owned by the Ngunnawal people, and I'd like to take the opportunity to pay my respects and our respects to the elders past, present and emerging from each of those lands, including those in all of the New World. So today we are trying to keep all of the mics and videos off to ensure that there's better bandwidth. You all have access to the chat function, and I will ask questions on your behalf at the appropriate time. So please place your questions in the chat room or the chat kind of space. And now I'm very happy to introduce you to Mistress Rowan, who's teaching a class on Spanish embroidery. Hi Rowan, thanks for your time, and I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you, Kiriel. Hello, I was going to say good morning or afternoon, but I guess it depends where you are. I'm Mistress Rowan from the Kingdom of Lochac, and the class I'm teaching today is on Spanish embroidery, particularly embroidery of the 16th century, although obviously many of the techniques are much older than that. It's more that the examples that I'm drawing from will be focused on the 16th century. So what I'm going to cover in this class is having a look at the different types of embroidery that we know were evident at that time, and we know that from sources such as artworks, paintings, manuscripts and sculptures. We know that because Spain is amazingly rich in extant garments compared to many other countries. It's such a rich field. And we also know that because we have wardrobe accounts from the time, particularly from the royal end of the spectrum. So we have quite a lot of information about the style of embroidery, what the terms were used, and the materials that were used. Mistress Constantia asked me to teach this class, and it was a very fuzzy class to begin with, and I've really only found my focus in the last few days for this. So I have a lot of material. Hopefully it will make sense and I'll put it together in a coherent manner. What I really want to do is to talk to you about understanding the different kinds of stitches and techniques and how they look in real life, so that you can better interpret those same techniques when you see them in art. Most of what we're doing is using art to inspire our own work, and the more you know about the embroidery, the better you are at making a good guess about what the techniques are that you're seeing portrayed in often a fairly slapdash manner. I'm going to begin this by running through a PowerPoint presentation, which I'll be speaking over, and then we get to the end of that, then we'll be doing some questions, and I have some physical things to show you as well. So let's get started. Ha! This would help if I shared my screen with you. Let me do this again.
That's all right. While you're doing that, I'll just pass on that everybody's just still in this class also very jealous of your wall of fabric.
My fabulous wall. Okay. Take 2 on the slideshow. Nope, it's not showing. Why are we not showing?
We can see
There
it.
we go. So as I said, now the background to this is a piece that I worked, obviously not on clothing, it's on a book cover, but I think it kind of expresses the richness that I see in much of the 16th century Spanish embroidery at the top end. And as Mistress Constantia pointed out, it has both pomegranates and roses. On which point, before I get started, I want to say a real thank you to Mistress Constantia and Donna Mariana, because they let me have free access to their fabulous Flickr accounts to use the materials, and that was just an amazing trove. Embroidery in context. Much of the embroidery that we see at this time, and indeed at earlier times, is not confined to a single country. most of the techniques and indeed many of the designs are seen across all of the countries. There was a huge amount of trade going on, but there were definite fashions in some countries that did not exist in other countries. So if we look at these two images, the one on the left could be anything. It could be Spanish, but it could also be Italian or German. You could absolutely believe that image came from those other countries. Whereas the image on the right is clearly Spanish. You only see those sleeves with those amazing embroidered tiras in Spain. So how do we know what comes from where? And how do we know what's appropriate when we're trying to reproduce these? We need to consider several factors. What is the class of the image that we're looking at? What is the class of the garb that we're trying to develop? What's the garment? Because some embroidery styles are only seen on some specific garments. So if we have a look at these two examples, the one on the left is obviously a mid-class of things. And if you look at the embroidery on her camisa and also on her headwear, it's a very different kind of embroidery to that on the right. The garment on the right is clearly being worn by somebody from the nobility. It's a set of trunk hose and it has very elaborate embroidery in gold on it, whereas the mid-class lady has work that is in silk on linen. Very different kinds of techniques. Local fashions I mentioned. So one of the ironies is that this was called Spanish work in England, but this style of Spanish work, or black work as we more commonly call it, was never seen in Spain. This was the English version. So it developed, they think, from Catherine of Aragon, although there were absolutely examples of it earlier and recorded earlier and in other countries. But this full-blown style with the filling stitches and so on is an English phenomenon, not a Spanish one. So when you're considering embroidering a particular piece of garment, think about, is the embroidery appropriate for this type of garment? Is it appropriate for the country, for the location? Is it right for this time period? And is it right for this class? Because the nobility had a hell of a lot more embroidery on their garb than lower down the social scale. And then digging a bit deeper, what are the appropriate designs for the type of embroidery that you've selected? What are the appropriate ground fabrics? What are the appropriate threads and embellishments? And what are the right colours? So the aim is to make a thing from a specific time and place. And I'm using the hat that I made because I think that's probably the only piece of specifically Spanish stuff that I've done that has embroidery on it. Doesn't have much embroidery on it, but you know, work with me on this. The technique is right for the stitch. So I've used a long chain stitch, I've used double running stitch, and I've used spider webs, all of those in gold twist on the black. The materials, the colour, the weight of the ground, they're all appropriate to this particular piece. This is black velvet and satin, and those were the same materials that we used in the original that I based this piece on. The same with the embroidery threads. So in this case, I've got gold twist that I've been using. And the other thing that you want is that the piece looks right overall. So the right scale, the right proportions, the right amount of embroidery in the right places, all of that is what you're aiming for. Sources. Where do we go to find out this information? I'll start with a warning about Pinterest. I know everybody loves it. I know everybody lives on Pinterest, but it has some issues. Particularly beware of the descriptions and the dates and so on. They're not always accurate. You quite often see an image where somebody has said that it comes from this particular time and place, and I know absolutely that that is not the source of that image. So do not blindly trust. Trace it back to the source. If it's linked back to a museum, brilliant. Go back and have a look at the original. If it's not linked back, and a lot of them aren't, use a Google image reverse search to find where that image really does come from. That said, of course, it's a great starting point and it can open your eyes to a whole lot of opportunities and a whole lot of images that you may never have seen. So I certainly don't diss it as a tool. Just don't be aware of its limitations. Other good sources are extant items of clothing, which with luck you get to see in museums, or maybe you see published in books, or maybe you see online, and increasingly museums have got more content online, which is fabulous. There are also wardrobe lists, and which you will find in academic articles and in books. Wardrobe lists are brilliant because the material that survived is such a small subset and usually only at the very highest end. Whereas in the wardrobe lists, you find everything down to their underwear. And of course, contemporary art, paintings, sculptures, manuscripts, all those things that we rely on. But how reliable are these artworks? When we look at the artworks, how good a representation is that of what they were actually wearing and of the techniques that were actually being employed? So here's a snapshot, a little piece of a sculpture. It's actually from the end of the 15th century. And we can see many different techniques represented in this sculpture. We have a camisa at the top. So we can see that it's gathered into a band. We have a flowing scroll-like pattern, and we've got some straight line borders. So my guess for that is that I think that that's probably in black silk, and it's probably worked in a straight line stitch like stem stitch. Next, if we look at the saya, we can see that we've got a foliate central band, and it's been bordered by some other bands. So I think that what that is, given the shading on the background and the layered effect of the gold, you can see those leaves turning over. I think that that's flat gold work, and I think it's probably done on satin. And I think that along the edges, there's probably applied braid and maybe pearls, a line of pearls as those round things. Then if we look at the manto on the outside, again, we've got a foliate band. The background is hatched differently, so I think that represents velvet, possibly, whereas the material of the mantle itself is very smooth and bordered by something looking like cutting. So perhaps a snipped border. It's had an additional layer of a snipped border. And I'm basing that information on the fact that I have looked at a lot of garb, I've looked at a lot of extant things, and I've looked at a lot of embroidery. So embroidery in art is representational, but the more you know about embroidery, the better your interpretation. I'm going to talk now about some different kinds of embroidery for different kinds of garments. So I'm starting with linen embroidery. We know from the royal accounts, these ones are from Anderson, that there are many stitches. Now, in her book, Hispanic Costume, she talks about the specific terms and she gives her guesses or her interpretations for what those stitches are. I disagree with many of those interpretations, and so the information that I've given you here is what I think those stitches are based on extant examples and based on other research that I've done. So the stitches, the Spanish terms for the stitches are the ones that she quotes from the wardrobes, but the translation to the modern stitch term are my translations. So we have what I think is stem stitch, chain stitch, and Pekingese stitch. The Punto Real was the most interesting one to try and figure out. And those are all linear stitches. Then we have some stitches that are not linear, but are much more pattern making. So we have cross stitch, but my belief is that it's long-armed cross stitch. It's not the modern simple cross stitch. And we have one that she didn't describe, but she described the context and some comments about it at the time. And I absolutely believe this to be pattern darning, which was extremely prevalent in the Moorish areas and was exported, was very common in Spain and transferred from there to many other countries. We also have flat stitch, so satin stitch, and what I believe is drawn work frayed work. And finally, tight, which I believe is quilted work. And there's a surprising amount of quilted stuff in the Spanish extant garments. I really didn't realize how much there was. You see a little bit of it in Italy, not much of it in France, Germany, and England. So I found that fascinating. So I'm going to go through each of these stitches and we'll have a bit of a deeper dive. So the first one, stem stitch. Stem stitch is a simple stitch which you work, it's kind of like an upside down back stitch. Oh, no, I don't want to do that. I want to go back. No, it's not going to let me go back. Ah, damn. Yes, there we go. So stem stitch. It's a really simple linear stitch. It's very fast to work. It works extremely well around curves and it's been used for many hundreds of years. The next one I think is chain stitch, which was not mentioned by Anderson, but is certainly mentioned in other sources. Again, a very simple linear stitch gives you a thicker, heavier sort of line. And Pekingese stitch, which is what I believe was called royal stitch. And there are examples of it in some of the garb. And the images on the right, you can see all use these linear stitches. So when you're looking at work and you're seeing straight lines, particularly flowing lines, that's going to be a linear stitch that you need to use to get that effect. Here's just looking at stem stitch. Here's an example you can see on her camisa. And if we look at that zoomed in, you can see that it's definitely made of one of these linear stitches. It's not a graphic geometric thing. And there's an example that I didn't work, but Mistress Consandia worked. And you can see how appropriate that is for that kind of work. Here's an example which has many different elements in it. It's a woman's camisa, Castilian court from the early 16th century. It has multiple different kinds of things. So Pekingese stitch, royal stitch, which is basically a back stitch, which then has a contrasting thread looped through it. There's laid and couched work, which I'll talk about later. And there's also Cretan stitch, which is called Persian stitch in the Spanish manuscripts. And my interpretation of that is that it's Cretan stitch. Now let's have a look at another group of embroidery, which is counted work. So the two most common ones here that Anderson talked about, my interpretation of them are long-armed cross stitch and pattern darning. And the examples here you can see on the right, you can see the edge of those camisas. That's the kind of thing that I think those are. In both cases, they're a very geometric effect, and that's the easiest way to get that effect. And if we look at some actual examples here, the top is a piece of long-armed cross stitch that I did. It has very distinctive lines running through it. It almost looks like knitting, like you've knitted a row up and back each time. And it's actually, I think it's faster to work than regular cross stitch. And the other one is pattern darning, which can be done straight on fabric in the example that I did on the left, the blue one. And it can also be worked over pleats, which is something I've only just been playing with recently. And you can see the example there of the piece that I've worked. And if you look at the image on the right there, you can see that this is a potential thing for how that collar was done. It might also have been straight smocking. That would be another way of achieving that. But in that case, you'd have to back smock the whole thing to make it stay stable. I think it's been done as pattern done. Here's another extant piece. This is a woman's shirt. It's actually very early 17th century, embroidered in black wool. And if you look at the highlight, the close-up of the sleeve, to me, that is absolutely pattern darning over pleats. It looks just like the stuff that I have done. Now, white work, which covers a range of things. If you look at the image on the right, you can see, not very clearly, around the neck of his camisa, you can see you've got white on white and it's kind of raised. That could be done in a few different techniques. One is satin stitch, flat stitch, usually done in silk on linen. The second thing, not represented here, is drawn work, where you're cutting the threads and you're drawing out some or all of that material, and then you're using the remaining material to stitch together to create sort of like a built-in lacework. And finally, quilting. As I said, I was pretty excited to see how much there was. Now, this example here is not a Spanish example. This example is a piece of the Tristan quilt, but it shows it really well. A lot of this quilting was done not how we do modern quilting, by padding the layers together and then sewing down channels. It was done by taking two pieces of fabric, sewing them together, and then stuffing them from the back with either long threads of wool or cotton, particularly in Spain, to make a trapunto, a linear one, or to stuff it with actually loose wool and then sew up that little slit at the back. And here's an example. This is like a sampler for white work, this particular shirt. It's amazing. You can see that we've got quilting. That's how that amazing cuff is achieved. It's quilted. You can see that we've got drawn work on the bottom around the hem, both a band just above the hem and the hem itself is hem stitched up. You can see that we've got satin stitch, flat work, which is done over the shoulder, and indeed an entire massive panel on the front. And we've also got faggoting, holding all of the seams together. Not something that was mentioned in Anderson, but certainly something that is very evident on 16th century shirts across many different areas. Truly a wonderful piece.
I'm building up with a few questions. Rowan, is it okay to interrupt you at this moment? So going back a little bit in time, we had a question about the first camisa, the one with all of that metal work on it, and whether you know what museum that was from, so that we can go and explore it and dive into it. And the
that one,
this one, yeah, the one with the Pekingese.
I will put. I didn't write that on here. I do have that information, and I will put that information up in a place that people can get to it after this forum.
Great. And then moving to another one, I think there was another question about another chemise, but keep going forward. It's about the next question's about the darning on the pattern darning, that you keep going on the extant piece.
Yes.
And whether whether the darning is on the pleated fabric is running across the pleats or along them, and additionally whether it goes through to the back, whether you think it goes through the back of the pleats.
When we get to the end of this, I have physical examples of many of these, and I can show you some of this stuff in more detail.
Awesome. That's great. And again, they would love to know where this camisa is from as well. Thanks.
Okay. Okay. So I also found a great example of quilting in art. So here's a 16th century, early 17th century portrait, and you can see the texture on her gown there. That is done in trapunto quilting. Very similar examples seen in 16th century Italian work. This partlet, amazing partlet, again, has a number of different techniques on it. The borders down the edge are done in long-armed cross stitch, and I was able to zoom in far enough to confirm that indeed it was long-arm, not regular cross stitch. This section here is the drawn work, which has been worked in a contrasting colour, so not white on white, but actually a coloured thread. This is white work, so I couldn't get enough detail to see what style of white work that is, so I can't give you any more information. And this maybe is pattern darning, but it looks like it's got a bit more texture to it, so it's some form of other counted work. And I'll just get you to pay attention to the pattern that was used for that, and indeed used for all of those elements. All of those elements are seen in pattern books in Germany from the early 16th century and in Italy shortly thereafter, because they copied those. But many of those patterns are also seen as far back as the Mamluk era. And if you go back to the 13th to 15th century, those same patterns are evident in much of the pattern darning that was used in their garments. Now, are there any more questions about the linen embroidery before I move on to the main garment embroidery?
I think we've got, we have just a comment that she thinks it may be pattern darning. I'm not quite sure what that, which that's referring to. We do have a question. Is there evidence of red work in linens?
Yes. So the most common colour was definitely black silk on linen or white silk on linen. Red was the next most popular. So red, definitely. And we saw that in one of the early examples that I showed you, where you could definitely see it was painted in red. So it was going to be worked in red. Other colours do appear, green, mulberry and so on, but black, the most common, red, the next most common, then the also ran colours. Okay, I'll move back onto the main garment embroidery. So again, we know from the Royal Wardrobe accounts quoted by Anderson about that there was a thing called punto embutido. Now, my translation of that is that this was intarsia or applique, because we know that those were commonly used there. She doesn't give a description for that one. My interpretation of the strung threads is that this is laid and couched work, and the dotted one, I think, is couched down with a heavy thread. There's also seed pearl embroidery, which she doesn't give a Spanish term for. Let's have a look now at those particular types. So the first one is applique. Applique can either be done as an additional layer sewn on the top, or it can be done where you cut the piece out and you cut out a matching hole and you sew them together. In both cases, what we find looking at embroidery extant examples is that there's then something sewn over the join to reinforce it and to also make it pop. Often gold, but sometimes something else. And I think that applique is the most likely interpretation for the lovely little row of moons along the bottom of her underskirt. And here's an example. So this is a real one. And again, yes, I will go back and write down where all of these came from. So this was actually a garment for a statue. It was a thing. And it was made of silk velvet, had a linen taffeta lining, and you can see the applique is a really effective way of getting a real punch of contrast in colour, and it's been outlined with couched cord over the top. Here's a much more upmarket version. So this is silk, and what looks like gold work, when you zoom in, you can actually see that it's not. It's actually gold fabric and silver fabric, which has been appliqued on and then outlined in gold cord. The next technique is gold work. Laid and couched work is the most common. When you're doing this kind of laid work, you'll notice that the diagram shows that there are two threads. If you're using passing thread, modern version called Jap, then you always use it as a pair. It was so from about the 9th century all the way through. Padded work is another version where first, in order to make a three-dimensional look, you're laying down an underlayer of padding. It looks like the extant examples that we've got, and I'll show you one of those, that was cotton. So it looks like the padding was cotton. There's also bullion work. Bullion is, or pearl, P-U-R-L, is basically made like a little tiny spring, and you cut it into sections and you thread them like beads, and you can lay that over padding to make it even more impressive. And there's plate. Plate is a long ribbon of the metal, and you fill in an area by lying it down, taking a stitch, folding it over and going back, and you're kind of zigzagging it along. And finally, there's cording, where you're taking a much heavier kind of gold thread, twisted, and you're laying that down by stitching over it. And spangles, also called sequins or O's. Off to the right, you can maybe see the gold on the red. That's a piece of laden couched work that I did as part of the Company of Broiderers banner. And you can see very clearly how the 2 lines of cord are couched down with a single line of silk. If we look at representation in art, we can see this particular example. I think that we've got linear stuff, which is laid and couched, and then we've got the inside of those squiggles, and that's a different texture in the art. And I think that that's bullion work. So let's look at some real examples. Here you can see the long lines are laid and couched work, either cord or flat pieces. And you can see that fill-in, that textured fill-in, that's bullion work being used there, probably over padding on the inside of those. You can see how they're raised. And you can also see spangles in there, sewn on individually. Some of these look like they've sewn on with a little bit of bullion to hold them down rather than sewn down flat. Here's another amazing example. And again, you can see laid and couched work. You can see bullion work. That piece there is not embroidered. That is a piece of tabby woven gold braid, probably band woven. And here we have some spangles again. And this one, you can see the padding underneath. Some of the silk, some of the silver has worn off, and you can see the cotton padding underneath, which is great. And you can also see that 3-dimensional folded leaf effect, which we saw in the original sculpture. This bit is applied cord, a very fast and effective way of getting a result. Laid and couched work. Plate, the plate that I was talking about, you can see the zigzaggy edge, and it's also been worked into that amazing bobbin lace. And the padding, which I mentioned before. So if we go back to the artwork again, now we have a better idea of how to interpret that. We can see here that we probably have that bullion work in the middle. And here, that's probably applied braid or passementerie or some sort. This example, we've got a different technique. I reckon that has been done by using an interlaced running stitch. So basically you work a running stitch and then you interlace into it, all using gold, a gold twist, a fine gold twist. Very effective and actually really fast to work. On his cloak, I think the outlines are gold couched twist. Those cross strokes could be bullion, they could just be flat pieces of gold twist laid, but bullion would be much faster. Purling. This is usually worked in rows. Now this is really different to modern purling. The way that most instructions tell you how to sew on pearls is you're basically sewing on one pearl at a time, and then you come up next to it and then you sew another pearl on and so on. That's not how the pearls were applied in period, and we know that because there are examples where the pearls have started to, the threads have broken and they've started to come off. So we know how they were applied. And it was done by threading the pearls on a really strong string and then couching down between each pearl. And that also is a much, much easier way of getting your lines beautifully straight and your curves in perfect arc with no wobbles. And you can see in the example of the pearl dress on the right that I made using this technique. again, if we go back to the art now, we can see what we're seeing. So you can see that we've got these lovely lines of pearls, and then they've been further enhanced by putting some laid gold work in there. Here's another example. The big row of pearls down the middle are actually the pearls she's wearing around her throat, so we'll ignore those. But here, it's represented as a little dotty line, so I think that that is seed pearls that have been laid in a row and then outlined with laid and couched work, possibly a single line of twist looking at that. And then there's applied braid down the side. Couching is another really important thing, not only just for gold, but for all kinds of other cord as well. And we've seen a few examples as we've been going along. You can see in this one, you can see I've highlighted one of the stripes on the arm. You can see that the dress itself is made of velvet, but the bands are made of satin. They've been worked separately and then applied. And the way that they've been worked is just using a heavy cord and then sewn over. And I think this is what the dotted thing is. You can see that the cord and the couching over the top together provide a kind of a dotted experience. And I also think that this is built up. So we've got that, and then the edges have been applied over a looped looking braid. So the whole impact is really rich, but actually not that difficult to do. And here's a very different item. This is a court outfit, and this isn't worked in gold, but is beautifully worked in couched cord. So we have a lot of fairly textured cord, which has been sewn down with silk, and it's using some other techniques as well. You can see the spangles put in between each zigzag. And we've also got single stitches in a flat silk floss, which have been put in and add colour to those, but it's a very fast technique to work. Mind you, it will also catch on anything, so not something you want to use on any hard-working garment. So the key points are that embroidery and art is representational. The more you know about the style of embroidery, the better your interpretation. When you're thinking about materials, assume the likely combinations. We know what materials they had. The ground fabrics were linen. For the upper class, we had silk, satin and taffeta, velvet. There was even fine leather for both jupons and also hats. The threads, silk, black, red and other colours, linens, metal threads, occasionally wool, and decorations could be pearls, spangles and narrowwares. Now, I haven't talked about embroidery on wool because that's not what I'm seeing in the extant garments. And as I mentioned, this is really the selection that we've got were the nobility. They're the ones that survived. We don't have much of the middle class. But I'm also not seeing very much of it when I look at pictures. Mind you, as I said, Spanish is not my main focus. When you're looking at designs, have a look at art, have a look at extant examples, and do have a look at pattern books. Even though they may be earlier and from another country, you'll find a lot you recognise. Consider layers. Many grand effects are made up of much simpler elements. And scale. Scale is critical to getting the look. One of the mistakes that people often make is to make something too chunky or too fine. Make sure that the scale of the materials that you're using and the scale of the design is right, and you're using it in the correct place on the garment. Pattern books.
Is this a good time to slot in a couple of questions, or would you like to?
Absolutely. Let's do that.
So Blanca asked a question, and it's going back a little while now, where you mentioned 2 threads being used, and
Yes.
she wanted to know, do you have any inference as to why 2 threads are used instead of 1?
2 threads, my view is that 2 threads is the ultimate compromise between not wanting to put down a single thread at a time, because that's incredibly time consuming. These are fine gold threads. But if you put down 3, they buckle, they don't stay flat. So 2 is like the sweet point between maximum coverage in the most effective time.
That's great. And a question on a garment itself rather than being about embroidery. Isabella has asked if the red dress, which is a few images back, if you have an idea as to whether that might have been a front opened dress or perhaps back opened instead. It's more about the dress rather than...
Yeah, I think I won't try and go back to that one.
Yeah.
I don't know. I wasn't looking at it from that point of view, but there is a picture of the back of it, so that might provide some more information.
Okay.
Or indeed, Donna Mariana, who took that photo, might have more information because she saw it in person.
I have passed on the name of her Flickr album so that people can go and explore that. Do you
Thank you.
have other questions? Okay. I'll let you get on. Thanks.
So pattern books. There are two examples here, and there is a pattern book which is available by PDF download, which is the Egenolf Modelbuch, and it's a German one because the earliest pattern books were, but many of the patterns in there you will instantly recognize as things that you're seeing on 16th century clothing. The one on the right, if you go to the Metropolitan Museum of New York and you search on Nicola Zopino, they have got images of every pages of this pattern book. And you'll notice that the top pattern in that looks really similar to the one that was on that partlet. Finally, something I want to mention is a slate frame, and I'll talk more about that. Much of this work you cannot do without a frame. So all of the work on linen, most of that you can do in the hand, but the frayed work, the drawn work must be worked in a frame to keep the even tension. And pretty much all of the gold work, and certainly purling and so on, you need to do in a frame, and it can't be a little frame. It needs to be a slate frame so you can stretch it out. And on the right, you can see an image of a lower sleeve that I'm working in a frame, and the entire piece has been stretched out, mounted on waste fabric and stretched out so that I can work on the whole piece at a time. Okay. Right, let's return to the real world, and I can answer some of those questions that you asked about earlier. So somebody asked about the pattern darning. The pattern darning is worked horizontally over the pleats. So here's my sample that I worked, but you're working over the pleats. You're using the pleats like your ground fabric threads, and you're going under and over. You need to make sure that the pattern doesn't have very long floats on the surface because they'll snag. 3 threads, 5 threads max, but you can go underground as much as you like. On the back, you can see that you can't see it at all. So basically, you're
just a little closer to the camera. Maybe.
Maybe. Yes. I'm just going to change cameras to my laptop camera. Okay. So here you can see from the front, and you can see the pleats going up and down, and you can see the embroidery going across. And if we look at the back, you can see that you can hardly see it. The other thing is that it's incredibly solid, and that's how this has been done.
That's great. We've got a question. Can you fill in stem stitch in the hand, or does it need to be in a frame?
Stem stitch you can generally work in the hand, so you can stem stitch usually works in the hand, and if I was working like the collar of a kameez or something, I would be totally working it in the hand.
And is there any evidence of knotting substituting the use of pearls anywhere? So if you couldn't afford pearls, you could do rows of knots instead.
I think if you couldn't afford pearls, you probably wouldn't have used pearls, but I haven't seen any examples. Doesn't mean that they aren't out there. It's just not things that I've come across in my experience. I think that the stuff that I have seen is using fake pearls instead of real pearls. So there was a big trade in fake pearls made out of fish scales and things. I think that's a more likely route. And seed pearls were not actually really expensive. Seed pearls were found in a lot of mussels and things that grew in freshwater. So they were available in all of the rivers and so on. And certainly you see a lot of seed pearls, and you kind of bought them by the kilo. So seed pearls were quite an inexpensive approach.
It's kind of the opposite nowadays, where you can buy quite cheap large pearls, but buying tiny pearls is very expensive.
Yes.
So do we have any more questions? I don't think I've missed anything. I'm just fishing my way back here in case I missed something. And we'd love to, in the meantime, see your pearl dress a little closer too. Just see it live. That's impressing the pants off everyone. Look at that.
So I don't know if you can see it. The pearls are laid, and then around the outside of each of these elements, I've laid gold, which you can't actually see in this image, but it really makes the pearls pop, and it really added a lot to the whole impact. Sometimes you need to think outside the square. I wanted to show you this, which I made for Nico. This was made from a great looking fabric in 2 textures, but I really wanted to make it, again, look a lot more impressive. So I have laid gold all over it. I did a sample and decided that I was not going to be doing it by hand, which turned out to be a really, really good decision, because there are 150 meters of gold laid on this. So I did that by machine using a very small zigzag.
Using
sometimes
gold.
Sorry?
Gold
fine
cord.
gold twist.
Gold twist, okay. Maria has a question about a type of lace, and where have you come across it?
I have a bit more information on the lace, type of lace.
I just shared a link to an object from Latin America. Somebody in a class I taught said it was called Spanish openwork or Spanish lace, and I cannot find a European example.
Okay. I don't know if I'm going to be able to look at this and look at anything else at the same time without shutting everything down.
And Marina, in the meantime, has asked whether you laid the pearls in the Russian style and over white cord. Do you know?
No, I've laid the pearls. I have made a video of this, which I will share after the class, showing how to lay a whole lot of things. So heavy cord, a pair of passing threads, simple gold twist, and pearls, because they all use a slightly different technique. So they're laid by, as I said, you start with a really solid thread. I used a heavy waxed linen, and you thread all the pearls on that, and then you're stitching down in between each pearl, and that's how you get them to stay completely in a line.
Thank you. And I've been asked about the red, your dress with the red, the pearls on it, whether you did that on the red velvet on the frame, and then attached it to the dress, cut it out afterwards and attached to the dress.
Absolutely. So as you saw in the example, that the sleeve that you saw is this sleeve. So I worked the velvet in a frame. For the sleeve, it was the whole piece. For this, you can't see it, but there's actually a seam in the velvet that runs down the middle. So I worked this in one spread out piece, and then I cut it out and I applied it to the dress. And you see this very commonly. You see a lot of decorated bands that are applied to the dress. And they were often then transferred to another dress. So if the fashion changed or you wore it out, they would quite often cut the embroidery work off one garment and transfer it and reuse it on another garment, because it's a huge amount of time and materials involved.
Thank you.